July 14th, 1944. A hedgerow field 3 miles south of Isigny, France. General Omar Bradley stood in the summer heat, watching a light tank reverse 30 yards across trampled Norman grass. Sweat darkened the collar of his field jacket. Around him, a cluster of staff officers and division commanders waited in silence, skeptical expressions barely concealed. The tank bore crude modifications that looked like they belonged on farm equipment, not military hardware. 4 steel prongs jutted from its front, angled and sharpened like tusks. The welds were visible, rough but functional. The entire contraption had been fabricated in a field workshop by a 29-year-old sergeant who had never studied engineering. Bradley checked his watch. 5 weeks since D-Day. 5 weeks since the greatest amphibious invasion in history had put 156,000 Allied troops on French soil. 5 weeks during which his First Army should have been racing toward Paris and instead found itself trapped in a green hell, bleeding men by the hundreds, measuring progress in yards rather than miles. The tank's engine roared. It accelerated toward the hedgerow, a wall of earth and vegetation that had stood for perhaps 1,000 years. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At 10 miles per hour, the tusks struck the ancient barrier, the hedgerow exploded, dirt flew skyward, roots tore from earth with sounds like gunfire. The tank pushed through under a canopy of debris, emerging on the far side in seconds, its belly protected, its guns pointed forward, its crew intact. Bradley watched the demonstration without speaking. Around him, officers began talking at once, their voices rising with excitement. But the general remained silent, his mind calculating what this crude device might mean for the offensive he was planning. For Operation Cobra, the breakout attempt that would either liberate France or condemn his army to months more of the killing ground that Normandy had become. What Bradley did not yet know was that this solution had come not from the engineering corps, not from army ordnance, not from any of the technical specialists who had been working on the hedgerow problem for weeks. It had come from a New Jersey National Guardsman with a high school education, a man who had survived the Great Depression by learning to improvise, to build, to make do with scrap metal and ingenuity. The device that would change the course of the Normandy campaign had been welded together without authorization, using materials salvaged from German beach obstacles, tested in secret, and demonstrated only after it had proven itself in field trials that violated every regulation about modifying government property. Within 10 days, Bradley would order every ordnance unit in the First Army to work around the clock producing these devices. Within 2 weeks, over 500 would be mounted on American tanks. Within 3 weeks, they would spearhead the largest breakout operation of the European War, finally freeing the Allied armies from the bocage that had held them captive since June. But on this July afternoon, as Bradley watched a simple invention solve a problem that had killed thousands of his men, he did not yet know the full story of how Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen III had created the device that would be named in his honor, or why the army had been so catastrophically unprepared for the terrain that every Norman farmer knew intimately, or how many Americans had died because military planners had made assumptions about French countryside based on maps that revealed nothing about the reality on the ground. The hedgerows of Normandy had been growing for over 1,000 years when the Allied invasion began. They had not been planted for military purposes. They had evolved from the practical needs of medieval farmers who needed to mark property boundaries, prevent soil erosion from channel winds, and contain livestock in a landscape where wood was too valuable to waste on fencing. The construction was simple but formidable. Farmers clearing their fields would pile stones along property lines. Earth accumulated against these stone bases over generations. Seeds from hedges planted atop the mounds took root, their networks intertwining into barriers dense enough to stop cattle. Trees grew from the hedges, some reaching 15 feet in height. Brambles, thorns, and undergrowth filled every gap. The result was a terrain feature unlike anything in military experience. Each field became a separate fortress, averaging 200 yards wide and 400 yards long, completely enclosed by earthen walls 3 to 12 feet high, topped with vegetation so thick a man could barely push through it, rooted so deeply that even explosives struggled to clear it. The fields connected via sunken lanes, worn down by centuries of cart traffic, creating a maze of narrow passages where visibility rarely exceeded one hedgerow. From the air, this landscape looked manageable. Aerial photographs showed fields, roads, scattered villages. Nothing in the photos revealed the true nature of the bocage. Nothing suggested that ground warfare in this terrain would reduce modern armies to medieval siege tactics, field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, at a cost in blood that would shock even veterans of the Great War's Western Front. Allied planning for Operation Overlord had been meticulous in many respects. Naval bombardment, air support, beach obstacles, German defensive positions, logistics, all had been studied exhaustively. But the bocage of Normandy, the terrain that would dominate American operations for 2 months after D-Day, had been catastrophically underestimated. Intelligence officers studying maps and photographs before the invasion noted the hedgerows but dismissed them as minor obstacles. After all, hedgerows existed in England. British officers who knew Norman hedgerows from peacetime visits either did not recognize their military significance or failed to communicate it effectively. American commanders, focused on securing beachheads and capturing ports, planned for mobile warfare once the beaches were cleared. The original D-Day objectives reflected this optimism. British and Canadian forces were to capture Caen on June 6th. American forces were to cut across the Cotentin Peninsula and take Cherbourg within 15 days. Within 2 weeks, the entire Allied penetration was expected to be at least 15 miles deep along a line extending through Saint-Lô and Caumont, swinging eastward to encircle Caen. These objectives assumed that once past German beach defences, Allied armour could manoeuvre freely. Sherman tanks had proven themselves in North Africa. They could handle desert terrain, mountains, even Italian hill country. Surely they could operate in French farmland. On June 7th, the day after D-Day, American tanks advancing inland discovered the truth about Norman hedgerows. When a Sherman approached a hedgerow at speed, attempting to crash through as it might crash through a wooden fence or a wall of sandbags, the tank's front end would begin climbing the earthen mound. As the front rose, the tank's belly, protected by armour less than an inch thick in most places, would be exposed. German infantry with Panzerfausts, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, had learned to position themselves where they could fire at exposed undersides. A single shot could penetrate the thin belly armour and ignite ammunition or fuel. The Sherman, already notorious for burning when penetrated, would brew up, as tankers grimly called it. The crew had seconds to escape before flames consumed the interior. Even when tanks successfully climbed over hedgerows without being hit, they were useless in the critical seconds of transit. The tank's main gun pointed skyward. Machine guns could not depress enough to engage targets. The tank was blind, vulnerable, helpless, while silhouetted against the sky. Tankers quickly learned not to attempt frontal assaults on hedgerows, but this left them with equally bad options. They could seek gaps in the hedgerows, the entrances to fields where gates or breaks in the embankments existed, but these openings were obvious choke points. German defenders positioned anti-tank guns and machine guns to cover every gap. Tanks entering through these passages encountered fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The third option was to have engineers blow holes in hedgerows using explosives. This worked, but it was slow, dangerous, and telegraphed American intentions. The explosion attracted immediate German attention. By the time engineers finished, enemy positions were alerted and ready. Casualties among engineer units reached appalling levels. Infantry faced their own nightmare in the bocage. The hedgerows provided perfect defensive positions. German soldiers would dig foxholes directly into the earthen mounds, giving them overhead protection from artillery while maintaining clear fields of fire across the enclosed pastures. Machine gunners positioned in hedgerows could sweep entire fields. Snipers hidden in the vegetation were nearly impossible to locate. American infantrymen advancing across a field would come under fire from multiple directions, unable to see their attackers, unable to maneuver effectively, unable to call in armor support because the tanks were restricted to the roads. A platoon entering a field might find itself pinned down by a single German machine gun team that would fire a burst, then displace through communication trenches to a new position before American mortar fire could respond. The fighting evolved into a brutal war of attrition. To advance one field, American forces would call in artillery to suppress the hedgerow. Infantry would then attempt to cross the open ground under covering fire from mortars and machine guns positioned in the hedgerow behind them. If they reached the far hedgerow, they would clear German positions with grenades and close-quarters fighting. Then the entire process would repeat for the next field. Progress was measured in fields per day. A good day might see an advance of 400 yards. A bad day might cost 50 casualties for a gain of 200 yards. The mathematics were unbearable. At this rate, reaching Saint-Lô, 15 miles from the beaches, would take months and tens of thousands of casualties. July of 1944 became known to veterans as the Battle of the Hedges. The fighting around Saint-Lô was particularly savage. The city was a critical crossroads, and German forces were determined to hold it. American forces were equally determined to take it, understanding that without Saint-Lô, there could be no breakout from the Normandy bocage. The casualties reflected the intensity. The 29th Infantry Division attacking northeast of Saint-Lô took so many losses that rifle companies were reduced from their normal strength of 150 to 180 men down to 60 men. The division attacking on July 11th, preceded by a furious one-hour artillery barrage, walked into interlocking fields of fire. Captain Charles Cawthon, executive officer of the 2nd Battalion, later recalled that by the time his unit penetrated the first line of defence, dozens of men had been mowed down. Between the La Haye-du-Puits and Lessay sectors, American forces suffered 1,000 killed per kilometre of advance. The 79th Infantry Division lost one man every 3 metres during the conquest of Montgardon. The overall casualty figures were staggering, an estimated 40,000 American casualties for a gain of just 20 miles. The human cost was measured not just in numbers but in the psychological weight on soldiers who understood they were being asked to advance into killing grounds with inadequate solutions. Morale began to suffer. Men who had stormed fortified beaches on D-Day with courage and determination now faced an enemy they could barely see in terrain that negated their advantages in armour, artillery, and air power. General Bradley understood the crisis. His army was stuck. The British and Canadians were stuck at Cayenne, held by powerful panzer formations. If the Americans could not break through the bocage, the entire Normandy campaign would bog down into the kind of static warfare that had characterized World War I. The Germans, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, were using the terrain to extract a price that threatened to make the invasion politically unsustainable. Bradley needed a solution. His staff needed a solution. Division commanders needed a solution. Engineers had been working on the hedgerow problem since mid-June, developing various devices to help tanks breach the barriers. Some divisions created their own tools. The 79th Infantry Division had a hedge cutter operational by July 5th. Other units developed what they called brush cutters and green dozers. But these devices had limitations. Some were too heavy, slowing tanks too much. Others were too weak, unable to handle the thickest hedgerows. None had been tested extensively enough to know if they would work at the scale required for a major offensive. Most critically, none had been approved for mass production and distribution to the thousands of tanks that would need them for the planned breakout. Into this crisis stepped Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen III, a man whose life had prepared him for exactly this kind of problem, even though he did not know it yet. Curtis Cullen was born on February 10, 1915, in Cranford, New Jersey. His family had deep American roots. His namesake ancestor, Colonel Curtis Grubb, had fought against the British during the Revolutionary War. The Cullen family carried this heritage with pride, instilling in young Curtis a sense that service to country was not just duty but identity. Cullen grew up during the Roaring Twenties, but his formative years came during the Great Depression. The economic collapse of 1929 hit when Cullen was 14. Like millions of American families, the Cullens faced financial hardship that required adaptation, resourcefulness, and the ability to make do with whatever materials were available. These Depression years taught Cullen practical skills. When you could not afford to buy something, you built it. When something broke, you fixed it with scrap materials and improvisation. Welding, metalwork, mechanical repair, these were not hobbies but survival skills. The young men who came of age during the Depression learned to look at a problem and see solutions in unconventional materials and unorthodox methods. Cullen joined the New Jersey National Guard before the war, enlisting with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, known as the Essex Troop. The unit had a proud tradition dating back to the 19th century. When war came, the 102nd was federalized and assigned to the 2nd Armored Division. By June of 1944, Cullen was 29 years old, older than most sergeants in combat units. He served as a tanker, commanding or crewing reconnaissance vehicles that were supposed to probe enemy positions, identify threats, and provide intelligence for larger formations. In North Africa and Sicily, this role had worked well. Reconnaissance meant mobility, speed, finding routes for exploitation. In Normandy, reconnaissance meant dying in hedgerows like everyone else. Cullen's unit encountered the bocage in the days after D-Day and immediately recognized the problem. Light tanks could not crash through the barriers any better than Sherman's could. The only difference was that light tanks burned just as readily when hit from below and offered even less protection to their crews. As June turned to July, Cullen watched the casualties mount. He watched engineers get killed trying to blow gaps in hedgerows. He watched infantry get cut down trying to advance across open fields. He watched tanks burn after exposing their bellies trying to climb over the earthen walls. The bocage was killing Americans by the thousands, and the standard solutions were not working. Cullen was not an officer. He was not an engineer. He had no formal training in tank design or modification. But he had something perhaps more valuable. He had spent the Depression learning to solve problems with scrap metal and a welding torch, and he was watching men die for lack of a solution. In early July, probably around the 5th or 6th, Cullen found himself in a conversation with other soldiers about the hedgerow problem. The exact circumstances are lost to history, but according to military historian Max Hastings, a soldier described only as a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts made a suggestion during this discussion. Roberts said something to the effect of, "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" The other soldiers laughed. It sounded absurd. Tanks were precision military equipment, manufactured to exacting specifications in massive factories. You did not just weld saw teeth onto them like they were tractors. Besides, what could possibly cut through hedgerows that had defeated explosives and bulldozers? But Cullen did not laugh. He had the mind of someone who had spent years improvising solutions. He understood that saw teeth might not be the answer, but the principle was sound. If you could not go over the hedgerow, and you could not go around it, then you had to go through it. And to go through it, you needed something strong enough to tear into the earthen base while preventing the tank from climbing upward. Cullen began sketching ideas. He thought about plows, about tusks, about any tool that could dig into earth and rip through roots while holding a tank's weight down. He walked around American positions looking at available materials, and he saw something that would make his invention possible. On the beaches of Normandy, the Germans had placed extensive obstacles designed to destroy landing craft at high tide. Among these obstacles were devices called check hedgehogs, massive welded assemblies of steel I-beams crossing at angles to form barriers that would rip open the hulls of ships. By July, with the beaches secured, these obstacles were no longer serving their original purpose. They were just scrap steel scattered across the sand. Cullen saw raw material. The I-beams were solid steel, designed to withstand tremendous force. They were already in Normandy, requiring no requisition or transportation, and they could be cut with a torch and welded into new configurations. Working with other soldiers in his unit, Cullen cut sections of I-beam from the German beach obstacles. He designed a device consisting of 4 prongs, each angled and sharpened, that would mount to the front of a tank. The prongs would be positioned to strike the base of a hedgerow and plough into the earthen mound, while the tank's weight was held down by the resistance. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The theory was sound, but theory meant nothing without testing. Colin needed to build a prototype, mount it on a tank, and see if it actually worked. This is where the story becomes complicated by regulations and military protocol. Modifying government property without authorization was illegal. Army regulations were clear on this point. Tanks were expensive, complex machines. Unauthorized modifications could damage them, void warranties, complicate maintenance, or create safety hazards. Any change to military equipment was supposed to go through proper channels, be reviewed by engineers, tested at proving grounds, and approved by officials with technical expertise. Culin had none of this approval. He was a sergeant in a combat unit, not an engineer with authorization to modify tanks. If his modification damaged a vehicle or caused injuries, he could face court-martial. At minimum, he would face severe reprimand for destroying government property. But men were dying every day. The official channels were producing devices that were not working well enough, and Culin believed he had a solution that might save lives. So he decided to build his device anyway, accepting the personal risk. With help from other soldiers in his unit, likely including members of his reconnaissance squadron who had access to welding equipment, Culin fabricated the first hedgerow cutter in a field workshop. The work was done quietly, without fanfare, probably during periods when the unit was out of immediate combat. The prototype was crude but functional. 4 steel tusks welded to a crossbar that could be mounted on the front of a light tank. The critical test came when Culin mounted the device on a tank and attempted to breach a hedgerow. Historical records do not preserve the exact date or location of this first test, but the result was unambiguous. The tank approached the hedgerow at speed. The tusks struck the earthen base. The steel prongs, driven by the tank's momentum, ploughed into the mound, tearing through dirt and roots. The tank's belly stayed down. The main gun remained pointed forward. Within seconds, the tank had burst through to the far side, creating a gap wide enough for the vehicle to pass. The concept that had started with Roberts's dismissed suggestion, refined by Culin's Depression-era problem-solving skills, fabricated with scrap metal from German beach obstacles, actually worked. Culin had invented a solution to the problem that had stymied the United States Army for 5 weeks. Now came the harder part, convincing the Army to adopt it. Military organizations run on chain of command. A sergeant with an unauthorized tank modification faced a difficult path to getting official approval. Culin could not simply drive his prototype to Army headquarters and demand attention. He needed his immediate superiors to see the device, understand its potential, and be willing to risk their own careers, advocating for something that violated regulations. Culin's company commander saw the demonstration and recognized immediately that this was significant. The device worked better than any of the official solutions being tested. The company commander passed the information up to battalion. Battalion passed it to regiment. Regiment passed it to division. At each level, officers had to make a choice. They could ignore the unauthorized modification, protecting themselves from any potential blame if it failed. Or they could endorse it, putting their names behind a device created by a sergeant using scrap metal without proper engineering review. To their credit, the officers in Culin's chain of command chose to support him. By mid-July, word of Culin's device had reached the 2nd Armoured Division headquarters. Major General Edward Brooks, commanding the division, understood the importance immediately, but Brooks also understood that for this device to make a real difference, it needed to be approved at the Army level. It needed General Bradley's authorization for mass production and distribution. Brooks arranged for a demonstration. The exact date was July 14th, 1944, 9 days before the planned launch of Operation Cobra. The location was carefully chosen, a field where hedgerows were thick enough to provide a realistic test, but accessible enough for senior officers to observe safely. General Omar Bradley arrived with his staff. At 49 years old, Bradley had risen from humble origins in Missouri to command the largest American ground force in Europe. He was known as the GI, General, a commander who cared about his soldiers and agonized over casualties. The hedgerow fighting had weighed heavily on him. His army was stuck, bleeding men, unable to achieve the breakout that strategy required. Bradley had seen various proposed solutions to the hedgerow problem. None had impressed him enough to authorize mass production. Some were too complicated, requiring parts that were not available in theatre. Others worked marginally, but not well enough to justify the effort of installing them on thousands of tanks. Bradley needed something that worked reliably, could be manufactured quickly using available materials, and would genuinely solve the problem rather than just ameliorate it. The demonstration Bradley witnessed that July afternoon exceeded his expectations. According to his own account written after the war, Bradley found Major General Leonard Hedgerow with several staff officers clustered around a light tank to which a crossbar had been welded. 4 tusk-like prongs protruded from it. Bradley watched as the tank backed off and then ran head-on toward a hedgerow at 10 miles per hour. The tusks bored into the wall. The tank's belly stayed down. The machine broke through under a canopy of dirt. A Sherman tank equipped with a similar device duplicated the performance. It crashed into the wall and pushed through instead of bellying skyward. The hedgerow, which had held American forces at bay for 5 weeks, was defeated in seconds. Bradley later wrote that the device was so absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. The tusk-like device had been fashioned by Curtis G. Cullen, Jr., a 29-year-old sergeant. The general watched in awe as a hedgerow exploded to make way for the Sherman bursting through. Bradley made his decision immediately. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel John Medaris, his chief ordnance officer, to begin immediate round-the-clock production of these devices. Every ordnance unit in the First Army was to manufacture as many hedge cutters as possible, using scrap metal from the German beach obstacles. Bradley wanted hundreds of devices, enough to equip a significant portion of his armor, before Operation Cobra launched. The timeline was brutal. Cobra was scheduled for July 25th, just 11 days away. In that time, ordnance units would need to cut hundreds of I-beam sections from beach obstacles, weld them into the proper configuration, transport them to tank units, and mount them on vehicles. The work would require operating around the clock, pulling personnel from other duties, and accepting crude fabrication standards in the interest of speed. Colonel Medaris returned to headquarters and issued orders immediately. Ordnance companies across the First Army dropped their routine maintenance work and began producing what quickly became known as the Cullen device, or the Cullen Rhino. The name Rhino came naturally from the appearance of the tusks jutting from tank fronts, giving the vehicles an aggressive, almost prehistoric look. The scale of the effort was remarkable. Ordnance personnel worked in shifts through day and night. Cutting torches operated continuously, slicing I-beams from beach obstacles. Welding stations glowed in the darkness as fabricators assembled the prongs and crossbars. Transport trucks moved finished devices from beach workshops to inland tank parks. Maintenance crews bolted or welded the devices to Shermans, Stuarts, and M10 tank destroyers. By the launch of Operation Cobra, approximately 500 Cullen devices had been produced and installed. This represented roughly 60% of the tanks in Bradley's First Army. The 2nd Armoured Division, Cullen's own unit, equipped nearly 3/4 of its tanks with the device. Other divisions equipped varying percentages, depending on when they received their allocation. The British forces, operating on the eastern flank around Caen, learned of the American innovation and quickly adopted it. The Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers began producing their own version, which they called prongs. 24 were initially produced from German beach defences. Production then shifted to the United Kingdom, where factories manufactured Mark I, Mark II, and Mark III prongs designed for different tank types. By August, over 1,000 British prongs were in service. The timing was critical because Operation Cobra represented the make-or-break moment for the Normandy campaign. Since D-Day, the Allies had been building up forces and supplies for a massive breakout attempt. British and Canadian forces around Caen would launch diversionary attacks to hold German armour in place. Then the Americans would smash through the western end of the German line, break into open country, and begin the race across France toward the German border. The plan was bold, perhaps desperate. It called for carpet bombing by heavy bombers to obliterate German positions along a narrow corridor. Then American armor would pour through the gap before the Germans could recover. But for this plan to work, the armor had to be able to move quickly through bocage country. If the tanks got stuck at the first hedgerows beyond the bombing zone, the Germans would seal the breach and the opportunity would be lost. The Kulin device was not the only factor in Cobra's success, but it was essential. Without it, American armor would have been restricted to roads and existing gaps in the hedgerows, exactly where German defenders expected them and had positioned anti-tank weapons. With it, tanks could cut their own routes through the bocage, surprising defenders and maintaining momentum. Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944, though the story of that launch included tragedy. The heavy bomber carpet bombing that was supposed to clear the way for American forces suffered from navigational errors and dropped bombs on American positions. Among the casualties was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater, who was observing from the front lines. Despite this catastrophic friendly fire incident, the offensive pushed forward. The American 7th Corps, led by Major General J. Lawton Collins, spearheaded the assault. The combination of overwhelming firepower, aggressive leadership, and the ability of armor to maneuver through hedgerows began to crack German resistance. On the first day, progress was slow. German defenders, though battered by bombing, fought stubbornly, but by July 27th, organized resistance began to crumble. American tanks equipped with Kulin devices could now choose their routes rather than being channeled into killing zones. When German defenses blocked one axis of advance, tanks could cut through adjacent hedgerows and bypass the strongpoint. The psychological impact on German defenders was significant. They had spent weeks using the bocage to channel American attacks into prepared positions. Now, suddenly, tanks were appearing from unexpected directions, crashing through hedgerows that were supposed to be impassable. The defensive advantage that the terrain provided was neutralized. By July 28th, American forces had penetrated deep into German positions. The breakthrough became a breakout. On July 31st, armor units reached Avranches, a critical town where the Normandy Peninsula narrowed. With Avranches captured, the door to Brittany and the interior of France stood open. August brought the exploitation of Cobra's success. American armor raced through the gap, some units covering 50 miles in a single day. The static warfare of the bocage gave way to mobile operations reminiscent of the armored warfare in North Africa. German forces, unable to establish new defensive lines quickly enough, were forced into retreat or encirclement. The Falaise pocket, where German forces were surrounded and destroyed in August, resulted directly from the mobility that Cobra achieved. The liberation of Paris on August 25th, the race to the German border by September, the optimism that the war might be over by Christmas, all of these followed from the breakout that began with Cobra. Historians debate the relative importance of various factors in Cobra's danger and success. The carpet bombing, though it caused friendly casualties, devastated German positions. The concentration of American forces at the breakthrough point gave numerical superiority. The distraction provided by British and Canadian operations around Caen held German armor away from the American sector. But the Kulin device was undeniably critical. Without it, American armor would have remained vulnerable to the bocage's constraints, even after breaking through the German front lines. The exploitation phase, which turned breakthrough into breakout, required tanks that could maneuver freely. The Kulin device provided that freedom. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, recognized the importance of Cullen's invention. In his final address as president on January 10, 1961, Eisenhower spoke to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and told the story. He described a little sergeant named Kulin who had an idea about fastening great big steel knives in front of tanks so they could cut through hedgerows at ground level. The idea was brought up through the chain of command and got high enough that General Bradley did something about it very quickly. Eisenhower emphasized that this was the kind of innovation that comes from the front lines, from soldiers who see problems and devise solutions without waiting for official channels. He noted that the biggest and happiest group in all the Allied armies that night after the demonstration were those who knew that this thing worked. Cullen himself received the Legion of Merit for his invention. The citation recognized that his device had saved lives and materially improved combat crew morale. But Cullen, according to multiple accounts, was an honest man who attempted to give credit to Roberts, the Tennessee soldier whose casual suggestion had sparked the idea. The Army, however, was not interested in shared credit. Cullen became the face of the invention, the name attached to the device, the sergeant who became a very American kind of national hero. The publicity was uncomfortable for Cullen. He had not sought recognition. He had simply seen a problem and worked to solve it. Being singled out for innovation felt wrong to a man who understood that soldiers all over Normandy were adapting, improvising, and finding ways to survive and accomplish their missions. The war was not finished with Curtis Cullen. After the success of Operation Cobra and the breakout from Normandy, American forces pursued German armies across France. By autumn of 1944, the pursuit had reached the German border. There, in the dense forests along the frontier, American forces encountered new horrors. The Hurtgen Forest, a 50-square-mile area of dense woods and difficult terrain just inside Germany, became the site of one of the longest and bloodiest battles American forces fought in Europe. From September of 1944 through February of 1945, American divisions attacked through forests, where visibility was measured in yards, where artillery fire exploded in treetops, showering fragments down on soldiers below, where cold and wet sapped strength as effectively as enemy fire. Cullen's unit fought in the Hurtgen Forest in the autumn of 1944. The reconnaissance role that had made sense in open country became suicidal in dense forest. Several months after his hedgerow cutter had helped liberate France, Cullen stepped on a landmine. The explosion destroyed his leg below the knee. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a rear area facility, then eventually back to the United States. The wound ended his combat service, but not his life. After recovering and being fitted with a prosthetic leg, Cullen returned to civilian life. He married Bernice Enright in 1945. They settled in New York City, where Cullen took a job as a salesman for Schenley Industries, a liquor distributor. The transition from war hero to liquor salesman might seem anticlimactic, but it was typical of the generation that fought World War II. These men did not define themselves by their military service. They had jobs to return to, families to raise, lives to rebuild. The war was something they had done because it needed doing, not an identity to carry forward indefinitely. Cullen worked as a salesman for nearly 2 decades. He and Bernice lived quietly in Greenwich Village. He did not seek publicity or trade on his wartime fame. When asked about the hedgerow cutter, he spoke matter-of-factly about seeing a problem and building a solution, always attempting to redirect credit toward Roberts, whose name had been lost to history. Curtis Grubb Cullen III died on November 20, 1963, at the age of 48. The cause of death is not widely documented, but 48 was tragically young, even by the standards of his generation. He was survived by his wife Bernice, and by a legacy that extended far beyond his brief celebrity in the summer of 1944. A plaque honoring Cullen was later placed on a boulder on the North Union Avenue side of the Cranford Municipal Building in his hometown. The simple memorial recognizes that a local man had contributed substantially to the Allied victory in Normandy. But the fuller story of what Cullen's invention represented, beyond its tactical importance, deserves examination. The Cullen hedgerow cutter stands as a case study in military innovation under pressure. The official Army system for developing new equipment involved research, engineering studies, prototype development, testing at proving grounds, evaluation by technical committees, and production planning. This system worked well for equipment that could be developed before combat, tested thoroughly, and manufactured in quantity before deployment. But combat produces problems that peacetime planning cannot anticipate. The bocage of Normandy was such a problem. No amount of map study or aerial photography could have revealed its true military significance. Only soldiers fighting in the terrain understood what was needed, and by the time the problem was recognized, there was no time for the normal development process. The official solutions to the hedgerow problem were slow in coming and limited in effectiveness. Various units developed their own devices, demonstrating that the problem was recognized widely, but none of these official solutions achieved the combination of simplicity, effectiveness, and ease of manufacture that Culin's design provided. What made Cullen different was not technical expertise, he had none in the formal sense, but rather the practical problem-solving skills he had acquired during the Depression. He understood scrap metal, he understood welding, he understood that solutions did not need to be elegant or officially approved, they just needed to work, and he was willing to accept personal risk by modifying government property without authorization because men were dying and official channels were too slow. This raises uncomfortable questions about military bureaucracy and innovation. If Cullen had followed proper procedure, if he had submitted his idea through official channels for engineering review and testing, the device might never have been produced in time for Operation Cobra. The breakthrough might have been delayed by weeks or months. Thousands more Americans might have died in the bocage while engineers evaluated welding specifications and stress tolerances. But if every sergeant felt empowered to modify military equipment based on personal judgment, the results could be catastrophic. Unauthorized modifications could damage expensive equipment, cause safety failures, or create maintenance nightmares. There are good reasons why military organizations require approval for equipment modifications. The Culin case worked because several factors aligned. His modification was simple and did not interfere with the tanks. Normal operation. It could be removed if it proved problematic. It used materials that were readily available. His immediate superiors had the judgment to recognize a good idea rather than punishing unauthorized innovation. And senior leadership, particularly Bradley, had the flexibility to approve rapid production despite the irregular origin of the device. Not every wartime innovation follows this pattern. History is littered with field modifications that failed, causing more problems than they solved. But history also demonstrates that rigid adherence to bureaucratic procedure can cost lives when circumstances demand rapid adaptation. The best military organizations find ways to balance these competing demands. They maintain standards and procedures for normal operations while preserving space for rapid innovation when combat necessity demands it. They empower lower-ranking personnel to identify problems and propose solutions while maintaining oversight to prevent dangerous improvisation. The United States military learned lessons from the Cullen hedgerow cutter that influenced later conflicts. In Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, field modifications and locally developed solutions became common. Some were authorized, others operated in gray areas. The tension between innovation and regulation remained unresolved because it is fundamentally unresolvable. Different situations demand different approaches. What remains clear is that Curtis Culin embodied the best of American military culture. He was not a martinet following rules regardless of consequences. He was not a rebel ignoring all authority. He was a citizen soldier who saw a problem, devised a solution, worked within the system to get it approved, and saved lives by refusing to accept that the official way was the only way. The hedgerow cutter was not the only innovation that came from American soldiers in Normandy. Countless other adaptations, large and small, emerged from men who understood that surviving and winning required more than following doctrine. But Cullen's invention stands out for its impact on the campaign's outcome and for what it reveals about the relationship between individual initiative and institutional authority. When Eisenhower spoke about Cullen in 1961, he was making a point about American society as much as about military history. In America, he suggested, great ideas come from unexpected places. A sergeant with a welder's torch can solve problems that baffle generals and engineers. Success requires organizations that are flexible enough to recognize good ideas regardless of their source and implement them quickly enough to matter. This is not always how military organizations work. Many armies are rigidly hierarchical, suspicious of innovation from below, protective of established procedures. The fact that the United States Army in 1944 was flexible enough to adopt Culin's device within days of seeing it demonstrated speaks well of American military culture at that moment in history. The cost of not having the Culin device can be estimated by examining casualty rates before and after its adoption. The Battle of the Hedges from June to late July cost 40,000 American casualties for an advance of 20 miles. Once Operation Cobra broke through and exploitation began, casualty rates dropped dramatically, even as the pace of advance increased geometrically. Obviously, many factors contributed to this change. The Germans were in retreat rather than holding prepared positions. American forces were more experienced in hedgerow fighting. Air superiority was more effectively applied, but the ability of armor to maneuver freely, rather than being channeled into killing zones, was undeniably significant. If we conservatively estimate that the Cullen device reduced tank casualties by 25% during the exploitation phase, and if we account for infantry casualties that would have occurred in prolonged hedgerow fighting without the breakout, the device likely saved thousands of American lives. The exact number cannot be calculated, but the order of magnitude is clear. Beyond lives saved directly, the hedgerow cutter contributed to shortening the war by enabling the rapid advance across France. Every week that the war ended earlier meant fewer casualties on all sides, fewer Jews murdered in concentration camps, less destruction of European cities and infrastructure. The strategic consequences rippled outward from one sergeant's innovation in ways that are impossible to quantify fully. The story of the Cullen hedgerow cutter contains lessons that remain relevant 8 decades later. Innovation often comes from unexpected sources. Bureaucratic procedures, while necessary, can become obstacles when circumstances demand speed. Leaders who empower their subordinates to identify problems and propose solutions create more effective organizations. And sometimes the best solution is the simple one that uses available materials rather than the complex one that requires resources and time that are not available. Curtis Cullen did not set out to become a hero or to change military history. He saw American soldiers dying in terrain that negated their advantages. He remembered skills learned during the Depression. He took scrap metal from German obstacles and welded it into a device that worked. He risked court-martial by modifying military equipment without authorization because he believed lives were more important than regulations. That he was proven right, that his device was adopted and mass-produced, that it contributed to the breakout from Normandy, these outcomes were not guaranteed. Cullen got lucky in important ways. He had supportive superiors. He got a demonstration to Bradley at exactly the right moment. His device worked well enough that its value was immediately obvious. But luck favors the prepared. Cullen was prepared by his Depression experience to see solutions. In scrap metal. He was prepared by his military training to understand what tanks needed to do. He was prepared by his character to take personal risk for the benefit of fellow soldiers. And America was prepared, by its culture of innovation and individual initiative, to recognize and adopt a good idea regardless of its irregular origin. In the end, the Cullen hedgerow cutter stands as testament to what ordinary Americans can accomplish when facing extraordinary circumstances. A sergeant from New Jersey, a man with no engineering degree and no special training, solved a problem that had baffled the United States Army. He did it with scrap metal, a welding torch, and the willingness to try something new when the old methods were not working. Thousands of American soldiers came home from World War II because of Curtis Cullen's innovation. Thousands more never knew that their survival depended on 4 steel prongs welded to the front of a tank. The liberation of France happened weeks or months earlier than it might have otherwise. And the principle that good ideas can come from anywhere, that solving problems matters more than following procedures, that individual initiative can change the course of history, these principles were validated in the summer of 1944 in the hedgerows of Normandy. Curtis Cullen died too young, far from the battlefields where his invention had made such a difference. But his legacy endures wherever soldiers face unexpected challenges and devise unexpected solutions. It endures in the military culture that values innovation alongside discipline, and it endures in the American belief that any citizen, regardless of rank or credentials, can make contributions that matter. The hedgerow cutter saved lives. It helped win the Battle of Normandy. But perhaps more importantly, it demonstrated that when lives hang in the balance, the man with the welding torch and the willingness to violate regulations for the right reasons can be just as important as the general with the strategic plan. That is a lesson worth remembering, in war and in peace, then and now. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.